to our second panel on science and security.
So we can start with the second panel, science and security. In this panel, we will ask scientists to analyze the role of science in important historical events and how the rapid progress of science and technology has its downsides. The best known example is, of course, misuse of nuclear technology, but today we also have cyberspace, medical threats of the pandemic. And in this topic, we will consider, of course, as very important part of the topic ethics and political environment and decision making. The panelists in this session are Götz Neuneck, Krunoslav Pisk, Branko Kolarić, and Nikola Protrka. And the first one is Götz Neuneck. He is Deputy Director of Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg and the coordinator of the Track 2.0 Deep Cuts Commissions. He is also the head of the interdisciplinary research group Arms Control and Disarmament and the professor at the Faculty of Mathematics, Informatics and Natural Sciences at the University of Hamburg. And of course, his engagement in Pugwash was already stressed in the opening remarks he gave to us. So I would like Mr. Neuneck to present his thoughts, and the title of his, let's call it, presentation is The Dual Use Dilemma, What Scientists Can Do. So, Professor Neuneck, could you address us? He was here.
I think he will speak last because he's traveling. He thought he's he's traveling to another conference, so he said that he might be a bit late. Maybe we can go on with the next speaker.
Then we'll go to.
We will return.
We'll return then to Mr. Neuneck. The second one was supposed to be, and now he's the first one, is Krunoslav Pisk, who was director of the Ruđer Bošković Institute and the president of the Croatian Independent Union of Science. He is currently president of IUC Association and, of course, member of the European Academy of Art and Sciences and World Academy of Arts and Sciences. So there is much more that I could talk about. A friend of mine, Kruno, but let's give him a word and he will talk about science, scientists, and society. Kruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello to everybody. So I have some presentation in two parts. First part is something from the history because I find very interesting and important. It is not in generally common. And the second part is something about science, scientists, and society, responsibility, and so on. And this is something this is not, this second part is not new because in similar situation, in similar events, I presented something of that. Let's start then from the Einstein-Freud correspondence from 1931-1932. Of course, just some insert. From Einstein to Freud. This is the problem. Is there any way of delivering mankind from the menace of war? It is common knowledge that with the advance of modern science, the issue has come to mean a matter of life and death for civilization as we know it. Nevertheless, for all the zeal displayed, every attempt at its solution has ended in a lamentable breakdown. So it's very interesting answers from Freud. First part, from our mythology, said Freud, of the instinct, we may easily deduce a formula for an indirect method of eliminating war. If the propensity for war be due to the destructive instinct, we have always its counter agent, eros, to our hand. All that produces ties of sentiment between man and man must serve as war antidote. And in conclusion, how long have we to wait before the rest of men turn pacifist? Impossible to say, and yet perhaps our hope that these two factors, man's cultural disposition and the well-founded dread of the form that future wars will take, may serve to put an end to war in the near future, is not chimerical. But by what ways or by ways this will come about, we cannot guess. Meanwhile, we may rest on the assurance that whatever makes for cultural development is working also against war. The next historical fact, which is much better known, is actually the letter from Einstein to US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1939. This is interesting. The letter is sent from Einstein, who is extreme pacifist. From the beginning, in the letter is something like that. Sir, some recent work by Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, which has been communicated to me in manuscript, leads me to expect that the element uranium may turn into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future. And then this new phenomenon will also lead to the construction of bomb. And it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bomb of a new type may thus be constructed. And what is interesting for me, and for us in Croatia in particular, is the last part of this letter. I understand that Germany has actually stopped the sale of uranium from the Czechoslovakian mines, which she has taken over. That she should have taken such early action might perhaps be understood on the ground that the son of the German Undersecretary of State, von Weizsäcker, is attached to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, where some of the American work of uranium is now being repeated. Why is interesting? Because this son is Karl Friedrich Weizsäcker, his colleague of Ivan Supek in the Leipzig in the seminar of Heisenberg, of course, seminar of Heisenberg. And then what happened? We know bomb was dropped, and then 10 years after, when the Linus Pauling visited Einstein in 1954, and actually in that moment, Linus Pauling was Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, and he made some notes. In this note, he quote for the Einstein, "I made one great mistake in my life," said Einstein, "when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt commanding that the atom bomb be made." And he, of course, he tried to find excuse because he concerned that the Germans were doing the same thing. As you well known, in the July 1945, Russell released a resolution, Albert Einstein resolution. This is something I started, or is the polling about Pugwash Congress and Pugwash movement. It is interesting to also say that Linus Pauling was acquaintance of Ivan Supek, and Linus Pauling actually he visited and Ruđer Bošković twice in 1957 and 1988. But what is also very important from that point, that signature of Linus Pauling on the appeal for the peace in Croatia, which is very, very heavy political document in 1991, 1991, his signature was essential for this action. One historical interesting note is also when in 1980, Ivan Supek, in some article, Science and Humanism, under the name of the paragraph physical appeal, he said, the universality of moral appeals is particularly critical in a time when application of science under the tutorship of political military leaders have brought the entire earth to the brink of total catastrophe. When in June 1944, at the Congress of Partisan Intellectuals in liberated Croatia, we anticipated the imminent use of the atomic bomb with its potential for the complete destruction of mankind. And thereupon immediately conclude that coexistence and disarmament were necessary. Others of this present dismissed the danger out of hand as completely unlikely and considered our conclusion anti-revolutionary, contrary to the revolutionary dialectic of Marxism. What is interesting that after this in 1994, in 1950, Ivan Supek was named by that time Yugoslav government in Belgrade to establish Institute Ruđer Bošković, this institute which was actually nuclear institute. But obviously just to mention that Supek was always and ever anti-nuclear weapons, and also he didn't like even nuclear energy. And the second part, I will talk two small things which are very general, not just for the nuclear weapons and nuclear sciences, but like some relation between sciences and society, like that. At the end of the 20th century, science gained deep insights and gathered large amounts of knowledge. For instance, physics explained within the same general model the structure of atoms and atomic nuclei, the structure of stars, and the evolution of the universe. Of course, there are many answered questions in different areas, and some of the problems are not even perceived. The prize for deep specialist insights in different disciplines seems to be the gap between them. Such abysses lead not only to the mutual incomprehension, but also to misinterpretation and the lack of respect, especially in the relationship between the natural sciences and humanities. We can expect an even greater role of science in development and economics in the 21st century, which is already seen as post-industrial era, before and today informatics, IT, platforms, social platforms, and so on, artificial intelligence, whatever it means. Science per se, or scientific facts, are neutral in relation to ethics or morality. In contrast, the use of these facts in technology and or other activities, for example in politics, is subject to moral evaluation. Today, we are witnessing many problems of scientific origin, which as products of science-based technology, nuclear weapons, radioactive waste, various types of pollution, and so on and so on. We know what is the problem with the climate and so on. Similar problems exist in socio-humanistic discipline. For example, the way in which historical facts are used in politics or education. All this requires greater personal responsibility for each scientist. Also, greater responsibility lies within the scientific community through professional association, etc., especially when it comes to informing the public. If today we are entering a global community, recognized and accepted shared values must be established. This requires dialogue between scientists and scientific communities with different fields. And second part in the end, something which is my position and for many other my colleagues, I call it scientific believer. Those knowledge is an essential feature of our civilization, and science is that essential lever that creates new knowledge. Science has the power of prediction, of course, with certain limitation, which certainly leads in the direction of safety. Science has value for the individual, possibly because of possible creative contribution or participation. Just to mention, I think that we can link to the Freud as an instinct of curiosity. But science is also a set of universal truths, so it has global significance and value. Of course, the use of scientific achievements through the creation and use of technology has led to real problems such as nuclear weapons, global climate changes, probably war part, but it is not clear what is this, how big is this part, species extinction, etc. Right now, we cannot begin to grasp what will be extent of the achievement of the discipline related to genetics, but neither of the problems they will entail. It should also be said that today experience teaches us that science and new technology are the ones that can solve the problems that have arisen through the wrong or bad or harmful use or technology or scientific results. It is interesting, important to point out that the inner limitation of standard scientific scheme, such in quantum mechanics, superposition of state or entangled quantum mechanical states open up entirely new possibility for technology such as teleportation or quantum computing. The conclusion is the following. We are aware of the problems associated with the phenomena of science and knowledge that do not lead to the security of society or to security of the individual. Nevertheless, we have the right to be optimistic and expect more positive contribution from science and the role and meaning of knowledge, but we need to place more focus on great care and sense of responsibility of the part of scientists and the scientific community for the problems of the wider society, and especially their responsibility for the use or abuse their results. Dialogue and or connecting scientists with all segments of society, from the general public to politicians, and especially with the education system in the segments of humanities, social and ethical disciplines. This is the end. Thank you very much.
Move to the next presenter. It is Branko Kolarić from the University of Rijeka, and he is member of the Scientific Council of the Government of Croatia. He was not able to come due to the responsibilities connected with the pandemic, and he sent us a short video to address the conference. So I'd like you to put the video on.
Distinguished guests, excellencies, dear colleagues, dear organizers. I'm Branko Kolarić, and I was supposed to be with you today on the conference of big importance. Unfortunately, due to the epidemiological situation in Croatia, which is not very bright, I am now involved as all medical and scientific staff in control of the epidemic. So I will do the vaccination program today. While you having this conference, I wish you to have excellent conference on behalf of us that cannot be present. Thank you very much.
So that was from Branko, and now we'll move to our next presenter. This is Nikola Protrka from the Police College Zagreb and the Ministry of Interior, and he is a permanent court expert in informatics and a specialist in information systems, security and auditing. The title of his presentation is Artificial Intelligence for Law Enforcement, Use Cases, Ethical Concerns and Trends. So, Mr. Protrka, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and I am welcoming you for this session that I can present something that it's maybe new in Ministry of Interior. It's related to using of artificial intelligence and all things that come with that, but including, I will say, just including in security purpose, law enforcement agencies. So I present a few words about that. I am working as a professor at Police College Zagreb, and there is a new subject related to artificial intelligence and prediction of policing. So I will say that according to Forbes, 83% of business consider artificial intelligence their major priority this year. So it's a big step from before. Consequently, it's now more important than ever to have a basic and sometimes detailed knowledge of artificial intelligence. So this is the reason why this subject is studied by students in our college. Artificial intelligence, it is one of the leading technologies today, which help us automate processes, streamline the user experience, and achieving tasks in much less time. Needless to say, artificial intelligence is also being utilized in every industry, domain, and technology sector to enhance working efficiency, and is increasingly being used in all areas of our lives. And as I said before, including law enforcement. So already today, law enforcement agencies unlocking the potential of AI in several important ways. And I will mention 5 of them. First is facial recognition. Then second, cameras. Third, as I mentioned before, predictive policing. 4, robots, all kind of robots. And 5, something new. It's called non-violent crimes. And I will mention that in the non-violent crimes, there is technology through analyzing images where AI can pick out, for example, counterfeit goods and counterfeit bills, for example, with a high probability of accuracy, spotting details that the human eye may miss. For example, if you order some wardrobe, some shirt with fake sign, artificial intelligence can recognize and say that this is counterfeit goods. Then AI in law enforcement promises greater accuracy than humans in matching faces and saves officers time to recognizing someone. Machines, of course, can use parameters to identify faces beyond what human can typically detect. There is example of few riots in Hong Kong where there was recognition using only cameras. And in most major cities, cameras are everywhere on the streets and in businesses as well, especially financial institutions like banks. Law enforcement often relies on this footage to review crimes after the fact and catch criminals, of course. And AI can not only apply facial recognition to these images, but also identify objects and complex activities like car accidents taking place. Object identification has other uses as well. Through analyzing street footage, AI can identify vehicles based on set characteristics. For example, they could show you every blue car that passed through a given intersection in a given time. Where this becomes useful is when officers are looking for a stolen vehicle, for example, or a criminal on the run and need results quickly to have. Then artificial intelligence predictive policing refers to the ability to predict where crimes will occur, the individuals who will commit them, the types of crime, and who the victims will be. Because of that, it can be done heat maps where we can see on a real map where something can be done. Predictive policing is also a controversial topic, but it's still a long way from becoming commonplace. Companies and police departments are just starting to test out predictive policing systems, and these systems could eventually provide significant strides forward in predicting and ideally in future preventing crimes. Then when it comes to predicting crime locations, there is certain algorithms that can analyze crime rates across various areas and develop a map of crime hotspots, as I mentioned before, heat maps, and this can tell police to target these areas for extra patrolling and surveillance. This is done through pattern identification, where AI offered the field of law enforcement an incredible opportunity to better prevent crime. And in this regard, AI can be used in predictive policing or the ability to predict crime before it happens. This is the main thing. The practice itself already poses many ethical and legal dilemmas, and because ethical dilemmas are part of this conference, this is why I'm mentioning here, and AI reinforces these problems as well. Whether, for example, in the detection of fraud, traffic accidents, child pornography, or anomalies in public space, AI has promising application for law enforcement, and we are using it already. And in this field, we can use it even more. And of course, indeed, that AI makes law enforcement work less time-consuming and less prone to human error and fatigue, and of course, more cost-effective. This is already proven in few fields. And the most promising application of AI for law enforcement is this, as I mentioned, ability to identify patterns, thus an opportunity to better prediction, anticipation, and prevention of the crime. And in this context, two questions arise. Who is targeted by predictive policing and for what purpose? And when AI is used in predictive policing to investigate digital networks, for example, such as trafficking, fraud, or child pornography online, it appears rather positive. But when used for spatial analysis to identify street crime and at-risk areas, for example, it has the power to stigmatize and to discriminate, of course. So the social effects of AI application in predictive policing are therefore very different depending on who is targeted and for what purpose. This is why we need to elaborate this a little bit more. While its use alone is not a problem per se, the lack of safeguards and the use of collected data can be the problem. As a result, the use of AI in predictive policing can threaten individual fundamental rights as well. And given that AI applications within predictive policing, as they exist today, threaten human rights, necessarily safeguards and legislation must be adopted to promote their more ethical use. Law enforcement has a duty to prevent crime where it can, but it can choose how to do so, taking into account the social effects of its action. How AI in predictive policing should be used, not as a means to oppress or discriminate, but as a means to process large amounts of data to better target the needs of the population that law enforcement serves. And then that will ensure that appropriate responses are developed for the benefits of all citizens. And for the end, predictive policing is likewise an area to watch, as it could have major implications for how criminals are caught and how victims are identified. Ideally, predictive policing will safeguard the public even more than before, but there are still kinks to be worked out as systems become more advanced. And there's no telling how these changes will transform the role of police officer and benefit public safety. One thing is sure, the result will likely have a major impact on us all. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Protrka. It was illuminating to find out of these new technologies in policing, and especially this one in predicting of the possible threats.
Of course.
Yeah, maybe we'll have some time for discussion later, because I think we will have some time. And the last contributor to this panel, and I think we still don't have Professor Neuneck now. Then here we have Professor Prug from University of Rijeka. He received his PhD at University of London in the deliberation of state and economy changes with the purpose to spread equal and participatory production and allocation models. He is exploring the specifics of social forms of production and their impact on development. And he'll talk will be today titled More Cooperation, Less Competition, The Road to Global Peace. Professor Prug, the floor is yours.
Thanks for inviting me, and my regards to everyone. I'm glad to be here. It's a hot topic, so to say, especially the last years of polarization in the world again. I'd like to talk about two, first of all, about economic aspects. We haven't covered them so far, and they are the driving force of the world production of wealth. Hence the topic. Peace requires cooperation, yet we live in a world that's driven by competitive practices and competitive behavior of social agents. That is, wealth is produced in social form. Wealth can be private, based on commodity production, or it can be public health, public education, and so on. And those two ways of producing wealth often clash, but they necessarily cooperate as well. Science, I think this is a statement of fact, nowadays cannot be developed without vast investments. And this is not something where Croatia stands very well. We are in the middle of EU chart for the production, investment in R&D in GDP terms. We are around 1% in science and R&D. The average in EU is around 2%, so we are in kind of in the middle of the bottom half. What is often not discussed in science, I find, is its social context, and that's what drives science. Normally, in common sense and among scientists, what drives people to it, the study is some kind of intrinsic motivation for scientific discovery, for use of intellect. UK Science Council defines science as the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world, following a systematic methodology based on evidence. Yet, without vast investments nowadays, this cannot happen. Then the question is, who are social actors investing and what drives them? And we have two types of social actors. One is private firms, and the other one is public institutions. And then again, the next question is what drives them? Of course, the private firms are driven by profit. Their logic is to produce and sell for more than their total cost of production. So to increase wealth, accumulate wealth. Their money is usually called capital investments, capital goods. Their job is to increase wealth, to accumulate wealth. Public institutions, on the other hand, they produce by different logic. They produce by logic of planning, by logic of long set of processes, by cooperation, deliberation, and they're not driven by profit directly. Their goal is to produce wealth in a way that has been discussed and decided on the highest level of a political community. Today, this is national state, of course, and then international institutions that also fund production of public wealth. The interesting point for us here is that science is driven by cooperation, and it's impossible to imagine science that operates without cooperation of scientists, without sharing of data, of findings, without peer review, without many processes and a long history of standing on the shoulders of giants, building slowly on top of the history and of those before us. Science has to be planned, has a competitive character as well, but is fundamentally driven by cooperation. Then the last question before I come to the concluding point is that what are the indirect goals of publicly financed planned production? Why do states invest in science. There are two possible answers. One is because we appreciate science, we have values, we have ethics or morals that direct us towards pursuit of science. I think there's an element to it, but I think a far more persuasive argument is that it is the logic of wealth production that drives science, that is, firms within national states have to be successful on international markets. The more the world global is, the more interest national governments and have to invest in certain types of science. And those types of sciences that will be validated on markets by producing private goods and by competing. And this is where we come to my last point before concluding. It's the role of military in all of this. In the United States, this is something that's well known among sociologists and political economists, amongst certain strata of economists as well. But economics as a discipline tends to suppress this, which is the knowledge that the largest funders of science in the world are governments, and especially early science, in basic science, as we call it. In applied science, there is already a mix of public and private funding. In the basic science, public funding dominates, and in the US, where the EU often looks for inspiration in how science is funded because of their success in technology, especially in the era of internet and computing, it's hard to find a serious scientific discovery where public funds have not been, if not equal, in most cases, driving force in scientific discovery, including the early applied science. So only where we come to actual products, that's where we see the private sector taking on and injecting its competitive nature and competitive character into applying science. The most known study, just to mention one well-known study, is study of iPod 10 years ago or so, when it showed that every single of the 7 most important components of such a new, at the time, consumer product, which has been hugely successful, as we know, it has driven the industry since. Apple has been an innovative company in applying science. All of its components can be publicly financed. In other words, public finance in IT, the internet has been driven by public finance, primarily by military. Military funds are where a lot of science happens today. They're hidden from public scrutiny because military has its own logic, military funds have its own logic. Their primary goal is to enable the government that invests those funds for its military dominance and its private firms to apply such science on world markets and to sell its products. So my conclusion is we have a world that has 2 clashing principles that are driving the production of wealth. Science is deeply embedded in production of wealth. We cannot speak about science without speaking of economics. But economics, science relies on pluralism, and science relies on battle and clashes of ideas. We can call it competition, but they're primarily a world of cooperation with some competition as well. And economics as a discipline in the last several decades has become a very narrow discipline, which has pushed out pluralism from its discourse, and especially from its textbooks and how our students educate it today. So it's very rare to find nowadays in economics, at least in education, a study of public production of wealth, of cooperation, and of its fundamental meaning and fundamental importance for the dominant private production of wealth. So to conclude, science requires cooperation, but so does peace. Yet the world runs on competitive, fiercely competitive model of private firms that compete, try to oust each other, buy each other out, produce better products, and we all benefit from it. But if we are to have peace, balance has to be found, and state involvement and public funds into production of science, their logic of cooperation has to be extended in other spheres so that military role in production of science decreases. And so does that importance of military for gaining foothold in the world, for being a world power, decreases. We're a long way from that, but the logic of cooperation and science are a second pillar, often not discussed enough, of development in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Prug. Now I see that Professor Neuneck is with us. Professor Neuneck, I already introduced you, so I will not repeat this introduction. So the title of the talk of Professor Neuneck is The Dual-Use Dilemma, What Scientists Can Do. Professor Neuneck, the floor is yours. You have to unmute. You have to unmute, Professor Neuneck.
Thank you
Yes.
for the kind words, and sorry that I'm a little bit late, but as I told the organizers, I have to travel 100 kilometers for another place. We have a meeting here of the German Physical Society, and I'm now here and happy to talk to you. The files I have can be skipped in for saving some time. I think okay, we have enough time. Good. Yeah. Then let me try to find my files here on the drive.
Možemo ih i mi naći, ja? We can find them if you want, Professor Neuneck.
We can open them.
Okay.
We can open them.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So then that would be even better. So then if you could open the files, so I'm a little bit relieved and can concentrate on the content.
Yeah.
Actually, I think the key issue is here the dual use and ambivalence of science. And we can learn something from history, but we also are faced with new challenges. The next slide gives you a short structure of the steps I would like to go. In principle, I think that open science should be open, neutral, should based on humanistic values, and should help mankind and not create new means for destroying it. On the other side, and this is the ambivalence, we also see national security, that scientific results as well as scientific approaches have been used by the military. And of course, we enter here the political realm. At the end, it is important to balance open science and national security, and also work for more international security. This can also be done by science, as Pugwash has showed in the last decades. We see harmful and destabilizing developments. Of course, we have to assess what that really means, could become harmful and destabilizing. And at the end, I could speak a little bit about current challenges we see. The next slide somewhat describes the openness of science. I think, in my opinion, it is some kind of new understanding for the human existence. And that was born in the area of enlightenment, based on humanism and idea of progress. But knowledge and also capacities can be used also or misused for deadly purposes. I don't have to explain you the methods of science. My successor already talked about financial support. So modern science is very expensive, and states give a lot of money for scientific work. On the other side, in principle, at least embedded in the German constitution, Article 5.2, it guarantees the freedom of science. But of course, we can question if we are depending on financial support, whether that neutrality and autonomy is really guaranteed. That is an internal challenge. The next slide shows the experiences we had during the Cold War. Of course, the biggest or the technology mostly capable to destroy the planet is nuclear military technologies, as we have seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But this development didn't stop here with the Manhattan Project. It showed us also during the Cold War issues like building the H-bomb, which is by the factor of 1,000 more destructive than a normal atomic bomb used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We saw much investments in missile technologies for ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, space weapons, stealth during the Cold War. SDI triggered research and development for ballistic missile defense, which was justified by saying we have to overcome deterrence by defensive means. This struggle goes on until today. We also know that there have been clandestine programs about chemical weapons, but as well as on bioweapons in the superpowers. But we cannot rule out that others also invested in these kind of technologies. Technologies proliferate, and if you understand their basics, then other states adopt this. And we saw in Iraq that was a main driver for going to Iraq. And then also the Iran file shows us that there are technologies which are dual use. Centrifuges can produce civilian fissile material, but they can also produce weapon relevant material. The next slide underlines the warning by US President Dwight D. Eisenhower. I will not, of course, read the whole text here, but at the end he said, yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. We learned during the Cold War that exactly that happened. Since then, it became much more silent on military relevant programs. But the speaker prior to my talk was exactly mentioning about the huge investment, especially in the United States, on military relevant research. We should also, and that shows the next slide, understand that scientists played different roles. So there have been people working for national security at the end. I mean, Fritz Haber was the example of World War I by being a more international person in time of war, changed this research for producing new chemical weapons. Oppenheimer, Werner von Braun, all these people worked at the end under war conditions, Cold War conditions also for national security, as well as people like Edward Teller, Andrei Sakharov, John von Neumann. But we also learned from Pugwash and other organizations that international security could be also prevent the use of weapons of mass destruction. It can make a contribution to end new arms races, as worked out in the famous Einstein-Russell memorandum. And with the help of scientists, arms control treaties have been established. And but there are not only international agreements, but also unilateral action. In the case, for example, for German scientists who made a clear statement in 1950 7 that they will not participate in any weapon research for nuclearizing Germany. And then with the creation of Track 2 diplomacy, the Pugwash conferences touched new ground in making major contributions to conflict resolution. Our Secretary General was alluding to that in his welcome words. But scientists are also active in international organizations for verification, UN, IAEA, CTBTO, or OPCW, mainly for chemists. But also working groups are studying models for preventing nuclear war by understanding better what happens in the case of a nuclear war, but also started developing protocols, tools, technologies to verify the compliance of arms control treaties. So we see we have different roles for scientists, and the next slide builds on the insight of Sidney Drell, a very famous particle physicist. Next slide, please. He said that history teaches us that new technologies have had a major influence on the structure, tactics, and strategy of military forces, and that technological advantage can prove decisive to the outcome of military conflicts. So the second part tries to elaborate a little bit what kind of tools do scientists have. And first and foremost, there are ethical regulations on the individual and institutional level. And that is discussed in cases, for example, like lethal autonomous weapon systems, whether scientists can here, based on ethical regulations, make contributions not to participate in that kind of research, which includes, by the way, the growing field of artificial intelligence. Then we have international regulations based on the UN Charter and the UNESCO. I come to that in some minutes. Then we have still a arms control fundament, which is heavily eroding, but these treaties are still there. And that means at the end that treaties create principles, what means stable, what means crisis reduction measures, what is the confidence building effect. So these principles are still there, although some of the key treaties like the ABM Treaty, INF Treaty, were cancelled by superpowers, and this erosion process certainly is one of the main concerns now, which has to be stopped. And I hope that scientists can play a big role here, because they were responsible to put these treaties on the stage. But now politicians, either by ignorance or by political will, try to dismantle these important pillars of the international order to invest more back on the old idea that only states are strong if they are free to use all weapons which exist here. So then we have also, of course, national regulations. Arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation is linked with national regulations in arms control. And at the end, it's also useful to understand what is the individual and institutional social responsibility of scientists. Next slide gives some key quotations by former presidents of Pugwash, Sir Joseph Rotblat and Sir Michael Atiyah. They are pointing to the fact that scientists do understand the technical problems better than average politicians or citizens, And based on this knowledge, that brings also responsibility. And if you are familiar with the debate about cyber weapons and cyber challenges, very often most of the people really are not trained in the details of the internet, and it is also the case in other parts of science. Scientists can therefore warn of further dangers that may arise from current discoveries. And one of the key issues which have been made by Sir Joseph Rotblat was always that scientists can have some kind of international fraternity, and that they can talk with each other, also in some protected atmosphere and with an honest dialogue on key issues. But we have, of course, also to understand that the political challenges are here, and that on the other side, scientists often are not trained to understand the mechanics and the interactions made destructive or made constructive, these different world of politics. So to bring both together is, of course, also an eternal challenge. The next slide explains what arms control is about. I will skip that. I find it always stimulating to make clear that arms control is not convincing the other to give up weapons, and it is always a cooperative-based enterprise, and it is built on parity. It is built on making real disarmament possible. So to prepare the conditions for future disarmament, or at least to prevent excessive armament. And of course, part of arms control is also verification. New technologies can help here to solve problems which are there in different fields. But we should not underestimate that the key principles and key objectives are important. So it's about war prevention. It is about risk reduction and threat reduction. It is about stabilizing a situation in a crisis. And it's also about non-proliferation, because if you set a bad example for a weapon development or the weapon use in wars, then other countries might adopt that either. And that is also another challenge, which we not only know from the nuclear technology issue, but also from other fields of technology. And important principles here are confidence building, transparency, irreversibility, if we speak about disarmament. So Paolo mentioned in his welcome words the amount of still existing around 13,000 nuclear weapons. And superpowers argue we have decreased these huge amounts we had during the 80s. But the material is still there, and irreversibility is not necessarily there. So these are principles which are important if you speak also about nuclear disarmament. Next slide. I won't go here into details. Everyone who is interested in arms export control knows that each state has different regulations. The European Union is working on the harmonization of export control. Of course, it's not only to prohibit the transfer of certain commodities or information, which is hard to do, but it's also about handling critical goods, including technology, software, and sensitive knowledge. And in the world of the internet, that is, of course, a big challenge here. The German Ministry of Economics has published a brochure, a manual for academia to understand these regulations. That's not easy. It's based in law. and very often scientists are not very much aware on these issues, be it equipment or even intangible expertise, which is hard to control. But it's an important part of the tools states as well as also scientific organizations have to prevent the destabilizing export of new weapon technologies. Next slide is referring to the dual use problem. The German academy, which is called Leopoldina, so it's comparable with the Royal Society or with the National Academy of Science, has published a handbook with the title Scientific Freedom and Scientific Responsibility. And it is appealing to scientists to have a special ethical responsibility that goes beyond legal obligations. The legal obligations of states are fixed, but the individual and institutional ethical responsibility is another important issue. And in this book, you find some ideas, some rules, even some committees which can be established in organizations to prevent the export of dangerous materials, knowledge, or equipment. We actually had with the German DESI, the accelerator in Hamburg, a quite interesting conference. Next slide. With people who are working with high power lasers. And you can do a lot of good things with these research tools, but also quite bad things. And there's the suspicion that given the actual power competition, mainly between the US, China, and Russia, could accelerate pressure on scientists not to talk with their international counterparts or to deny visa or to use the dual use argument to stop international cooperation. So this study goes into more details. I don't have the time. I can give it the link. It's at the end of my presentation. Let me finish by pointing to those scientific fields which are relevant and which can be put into the class of triggering new technological arms races. Next slide. Maybe I will not go here into detail. These are quotations from National Security Strategy document of the United States. It makes the point that saying our competitive military advantage is eroding. The US is leading in many fields of military relevant technology, but they see China here, as quoted in the middle, as strategic competitor using predatory economics to intimidate its neighbors. And it enlists specific fields where China is a challenger for the United States. So they label here advanced computing, big data analytics, artificial intelligence, autonomy, robotics, directed energy weapons, hypersonics, and biotechnology. So these are identified strategic fields where the United States think they need more to invest so that China is not defeating the United States in these fields. This is unfortunately the rhetorics of today. Next slide are the erosion of the classical arms control. I mentioned already the ABM treaty, the INF treaty, the Iran agreement. The NPT is under stress. The extension of New START is a very complicated field because in contrast to the debate we had in the 80s, where we had more or less parity in strategic warheads, there are additional developments which are a concern for all nuclear weapon states. Ballistic missile defense, hypersonic weapons, precision-guided conventional weapons which can attack nuclear sites, military nuclear sites, and also cyber attacks on the nuclear command and control infrastructure. These are developments which are very dangerous. And I think we need the arms control architecture to restrain these negative developments. Next slide is a list of new technologies based on an UN document as current developments with potential impact on international security and disarmament. You see here those fields which I have already mentioned: bio and chemistry, artificial intelligence and autonomous systems, advanced missiles and missile defense, space-based technologies. You have a panel on this at the end of your conference tomorrow: electromagnetic technologies, material technologies. And you have to ask, you have to answer here key questions. Are these technologies really, have they really an impact? Are they game changers? What are constraining factors? What does it mean for decision making in a moment of crisis? And of course, at the end, the eternal question, how to differentiate here between civilian and military use. So I think the only answer we can give here based on the historical files is that we need a better assessment of these technologies. Next slide. So what to do? I give you some examples. We need for specific fields expert analysis and technological assessments in specific areas based on arms control criteria. And that cannot only be done by some Pugwash active people. We have to involve industry, civil society, academia, and scientific organizations. And this is exactly why I'm here, for example, to speak with those in the German Physical Society who are at the edge of creating new quantum technologies or newer fantastic gadgets which can become also military relevant one day. Verification research is important. You need to verify access and compliance of treaties. And in Germany, we work since several decades, and I'm sure that my colleague Jürgen Altmann will speak tomorrow on this. We created what we call preventive arms control measures, which are based on criteria like crisis stability, arms control stability, risk reduction, verification potential, to prevent not only the misuse of existing technologies, but also to prevent the heavy investment of future military technologies, which are scientific based. Next slide. I come here to the conclusion in 9 theses. Science needs freedom, but in exchange, freedom also entails responsibility. And I think scientists should invest more in this. Scientific discoveries have benefits, but they have also a potential risk for misuse or destructive use. And that if that happens, that undermines the ethos of science. We should also be quite aware that discussions where scientific results have been ended on the battlefield are undermining the ethos of science itself. The scientific community as a whole has a special responsibility to understand the implications of the dual-use developments. Of course, things cannot be predicted, but scientists are at the edge of understanding what potential misuse could be. So they should not leave it then to the patent lawyer or to the industry which are using it. They should invest more on understanding the long-term consequences. That means one has to raise the awareness for legal provisions, especially in fields like nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, and of course, arms methods or banning the export knowledge to specific countries is also one tool. Other ways forward are risk analysis, minimizing risk by evaluating high-risk research before it starts. There's always a debate in bio weapon research whether that is really understood for specific parts of bio research. Foregoing research is, of course, the last resort. That is simply not possible based on the freedom of science in modern countries. But we can also raise the question, what is in other countries which are not part of the Western club? Education for younger scientists is important. And of course, research institutions can also develop ethic rules for handling science security relevant research if they want. Very often institutions don't have an interest on this. Let's be honest about this. And again, the new power competition between US, Russia, and China puts science more under pressure. And I think to prevent a new scientific technological arms race in fields like artificial intelligence, quantum theory, autonomic weapon system, needs also the voice of scientists. But speaking about scientists also, of course, have to understand the cosmos, the planetary system of politics. And I think Pugwash, and especially the Secretary General, was quite good in bringing both sides together. But to understand each other, you need a minimum on rationality and on some kind of neutrality about the problems which exist today and which will exist also in the future. So let me finish here. Hopefully it was not too long. I think these literature gives you the sources where I'm alluding to, and if you are interested, and you can pick them up in the internet, or can ask me about other sources here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Neuneck. It was really a pleasure to hear this presentation. And we are almost exactly on time. Now it's time for a short break. And after 15 minutes, I think we could move to our next panel. So thank you very much, all the participants. And it was really a pleasure to hear you all. See you in 15 minutes.